This is Savannah and Cheyenne with another Psychological and Brain Sciences Department podcast. Today, we are here with Dr. Rebecca Brooker, a psychology professor here at Texas A&M. What classes do you teach here at A&M?
So far, I have taught developmental psychology with a large lecture course focusing mostly on child development. And then I have research students, so Psych 485, like you guys are doing, and Psych 491. So that's mostly undergrads working in my lab, helping conduct research.
Oh, cool. How would you describe your teaching style?
That's a really good question. So I would say my attempts are to create kind of an informal environment that encourages reciprocity, right? So I really want the information that I present to be given to students to be based in research. And so students kind of have the most contemporary knowledge about the issues that we're discussing, but also to make it clear to them how it's relevant for their lives, either now or in the future, but also just relevant for them as like informed citizens of the world, right? So these are issues that you're going to deal with even if you never have kids, if you live in a world where you pay taxes or interact with your neighbors or go outside and see people at Target, right? These are all issues that you can see in the world around you once someone points them out to you. And so it's kind of a balance between really focusing on the research and where this knowledge comes from and how to interpret kind of the basic science of it, and then the applied stuff where you really think about how you're seeing this in the world around you and why it's good or bad or relevant or irrelevant, and really like what to do with that knowledge. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah, for sure. So what is your philosophy of teaching?
Right, so those things are kind of connected.
Right.
So my philosophy is really like if students can see ways to apply this in their lives, they're just more likely to not only entertain difficult questions and thoughts, but also retain that knowledge. So before I came to A&M, I also taught a lot of statistics, and it was very tricky. It was trickier. But there are still ways to think about the fact that you use some of these ideas, like deciding what's a significant difference versus not significant, and that those things are different in sort of a statistical versus practical sense, right? There are ways to talk about a lot of these things in ways that feel more relevant to you, to your research, or just kind of daily life. So I think my philosophy is to give students, or to try to give students, you can decide if I'm doing that successfully later, to try to give students opportunities to engage with this material in the way that's perfectly relevant to them, so that even if they're in a class of 215 students, it feels more hands-on in terms of the material.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about teaching statistics. Could you tell us a little bit more about your other teaching experiences?
Yeah. So I first started teaching as a graduate student, as will be true for most people you talk to, I assume. And there I mostly taught online courses and a face-to-face lifespan development course. So that was at Penn State when I was there. And it's really different because not only is the platform different, right? You're online and you're kind of facilitating things in a different way and presenting knowledge in a different way, but you get very different students. So people tend to take online courses if they're distance learners. So if there's some reason they're not close to campus or they can't make it in the 9 to 5 hours. So we had a lot of people who are non-traditional students or parents, which is fun with developmental psych, or veterans, or even people who were deployed in the middle of class. So those were really interesting. But I'm glad that I started with those kinds of experiences because it reminded me that people have really big life experiences going on outside of the classroom. And some of it is great because it's relevant to exactly the things that you're learning. And some of it sort of overtakes their ability to engage the material, right? If you're thinking about being deployed, the most important thing on your mind might not be all of Piaget's stages, right? So I think that was a really good experience for me. Then I taught at my previous institution at Montana State University, which was my first job. Most of my experience teaching was really in these like 485, 491 courses. I love these because my favorite part of teaching by far is interacting with the students. And this really allowed me to talk to students and understand like why they were in my lab and what they wanted to get out of it. And it gave me some practice kind of matching up what opportunities I was giving people with what their goals were, like what their career or educational goals were. So that's been really fun. And I think that's still probably my favorite, although my developmental course last spring was amazing. It was such a big group of students, but everyone was engaged and willing to be challenged and thoughtful. And, you know, we had quiet days, but we had days where sort of everyone had an idea to talk about. So, you know, there are tricky, there are not tricky individuals, but there are tricky situations where my personality doesn't match with someone else's. And so everything I say might not make sense, you know, might take them a few extra steps to digest. And there are just tricky days where people don't feel good, or it's ring day, or spring break is coming up, or it's finals week. But I think, you know, the more experiences like that you have, the better you are able to handle those things. And I have found the students here to be just really willing to work on those things, right? So if you say like, well, this is kind of what I can do with you, but I can't bend in this way for this reason, I found people to be really reasonable. So I think almost unanimously positive. All my experiences have been almost unanimously positive.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
If you could teach any course you wanted, what would it be and why?
Well, I think developmental is probably my favorite course to teach by far. But I'm really interested in what courses the students want. So I often find that students want knowledge about things that we don't think that they want knowledge about. And sometimes that's in a very broad sense, and sometimes that's in a very narrow sense. So a lot of students that come to work with me in my lab have an interest in developmental neuroscience. And sometimes that's just like understanding what developmental neuroscience is and like why is it different from other fields of neuroscience, and what kinds of neuroscience can you do with kids and what things do you have to do differently. And for some people it's very specific, like they want to learn how to study emotion processing, or they want to learn how to do ERPs because they're interested in how those develop over time. So I think kind of the questions that I get most frequently, probably because you know, my area of specialization is so specific, are about developmental neuroscience. And I would love to be able to design a course where I really walk people through kind of the different techniques that I use. I use peripheral or cardiac physiology, so heart rate variability, cortisol, so stress hormones. I'm making one of these quotation marks with my fingers. But you know, hormone reactivity to emotional eliciting situations. ERPs, I've done a little bit of FNIRS, and I think taking students through that and showing them how it works and what kinds of things we do with it, but also, you know, talking to students about, you know, what can we say just from using this technique and what can't we say? Because I think there's also some belief that if something is a neuroscience method, it's very impartial and, you know, it's good as gold. And that's not true. There's still subjectivity in this. There are definitely boundaries about what kind of conclusions we can draw based on the technique being used. And I don't know if that would be interesting to students, but I find it interesting, and I get a lot of questions about it once students are in my courses or in my lab. So I would love to teach something like that.
That's awesome. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about your research interests?
Sure. Yeah, I could talk forever about that, but I won't. So my research broadly looks at how aspects of the environment or behavior interact with aspects of biology to put children at risk for certain types of mental illness, so specifically anxiety disorders. So what happens kind of in your environment, or what kind of behaviors might you engage in tandem with what kinds of responses do you have biologically to stressful events or emotional elicitation, and what can we do when we know that, to better predict who is at risk for having problems. So I do this in a couple different ways. All of it really involves bringing children and parents into the lab and doing some psychophysiological measures. So we record naturally occurring brain activity to things like watching videos or looking at pictures or playing games. And also just paradigms where we maybe put on a puppet show. Most kids find this to be positive, or something that's a little bit scary. Most kids find this to be scary. Most kids find this to be boring or frustrating or whatever. But I think one thing that parents often don't understand about what we do is, like, what's interesting to us is that most kids are not all kids, right? So if you've ever been around a little kid, it's like you just have moments where God knows, where their behavior is coming from. And that's what's interesting to us, is that kids are very different from one another. And so statistically, we can use that variation to predict outcomes. So if someone is more or less afraid when they're, predicted to be afraid or not predicted to be afraid, that means something different. And fluctuations in their neural activity can give us a little bit more information about that. How they interact with their parents can give us a little bit more information about that, right? And so the idea is we use all these different approaches to just kind of garner knowledge about certain types of reactions and use that to predict whether a child might be at risk for or resilient to certain mental health outcomes. Does that make sense?
So we've really interesting.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoy it. So we've done that with preschoolers. We've done it with infants. We've started looking at how some of these responses, that predict mental health in infants might actually change mental health systems in mothers. So if you think about, a mom or a dad raising a child who is more or less difficult to calm down once they're upset, well, what does that do for moms or dads' mental health? You can probably make some pretty good guesses, but the answer is we really don't know the long-term implications of that, and the fact that this is a reciprocal system. So if I'm a difficult child and that becomes difficult for my parents and that deteriorates their mental health, well, they're creating the environment that then influence my mental health, right? And it just starts to circle around and around. So there's just a ton of ways to look at this, which makes me feel like there's so much work left to do. But, we're kind of chipping away at it little by little.
That's awesome.
Well, thanks.
Can you kind of explain how your research influences your teaching? So I guess an example would be like what ways you've been able to bring the insights of your research to your courses.
Right. Well, so I would say the most detailed courses, or the most detailed material I present, is directly in line with my research. And what's really great about teaching developmental is that, so Patrick Bolger and Rachel Hall and I all teach developmental, and we all have slightly different areas of expertise. So we're able to speak with one another and kind of check in and make sure we're doing stuff correctly, right? So one way I think it influences my teaching is really just the material about which I am most expert. But also, I think it's changed the way I try to present things, right? So textbooks oftentimes present things in generalities, and I like to look up, what kind of is the contemporary knowledge about this, or how has this been studied, and present that to students. I think it's really important that students kind of understand where this information is coming from and how to sift through it. I can tell you that this is also a two-way street, right? The things I have to do more work on to present in my classes sometimes just end up, coming back to me when we're planning studies or when we're working with families and thinking about, oh gosh, we really need to consider, X, Y, or Z. But also it kind of, I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but it also makes me realize how few things I'm an expert in, right? So you get your PhD, there's a comic for this, right? That if you can picture a circle, and that is like a bubble of knowledge, when you are studying for for your PhD, you study this little wedge out of that circle. And then your dissertation pushes out the edge of that little wedge a teeny tiny bit, right? And so it's like, oh man, you do all this work and you find this one area and you know it really, really well, but you need to learn so many other things, like how to dig for more information to figure out where your work interfaces with other people, how to take advantage of a great place like this where there's so much knowledge just like in these hallways and you can go talk to someone. So I don't know if that's really the content of my research influencing my teaching or just research experiences, but I think both probably contribute.
Sure. So how do you involve graduate or undergraduate students in your research?
Yeah. Great question. They do a lot. They do a lot of stuff in my lab. So at my previous institution, we didn't have a PhD program. So I spent a lot of years without graduate students, actually, or they just cycled through more quickly because they were all master's degree students. And so that has meant that undergraduates have done a lot of the legwork on the acquisition of the data that I currently have. So they do everything from recruiting, so hanging up flyers, designing those QR codes, figuring out how to present things through social media, because you guys are just like way smarter at that than anyone else on the planet, seemingly. To running the studies, so learning how to cap people for EEG, how to take cortisol samples, how to collect heart rate, peripheral physiology, how to do emotional elicitation paradigms with infants, with toddlers, with preschoolers, with parents, how to guide parent-child interactions. Then they, they do all of the AV aspects of that work. They do all of the behavioral coding. They do data entry. And so they do a ton of work and they do a ton of different things, which is why it's so important to match kind of their goals with, all of the different things they could be doing. And I try to capitalize on that. But it's been really great because people really have stepped up and I think their interests for some people have peaked. And they've ended up doing independent projects or honor species, and these students just go all over the place and are amazing. So they're in medical school, they're in PT school, they're in nursing programs, they're in clinical psych PhDs or counseling programs. Are just interacting with undergraduates. It's been really rewarding for my career at least.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Brooker. We will be back soon with another interesting insight into the faculty of the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department.